Hi, this is Peter Cooper, and we're going to do a bit of code walking today. One of the things I really love about programming is doing code walking, and I nearly always learn something useful from it, even if it's just something to do with an element of style, perhaps. And Ruby code is great to read, but it's also useful, it's been handy for me to read code for the tools that I actually use heavily in my day-to-day work, and there's perhaps no better choice for me, at least, than the source for the de facto official Ruby implementation, MRI. Or Max's Ruby implementation, or Max's Ruby interpreter, however you want to cut it. So I've read portions of MRI over the years for working with C extensions and figuring out weird behaviors in built-in classes. Actually, the last video in this channel is all about that. And also working out how to sandbox Ruby, which is pretty tricky. Someone who's way more experienced than me in this regard is Pat Shaughnessy, author of the awesome Ruby Under a Microscope book that recently came out. He digs into loads of classes and how Ruby objects work under the hood and stuff like that. It's really good read. So I hooked up with Pat and suggested we take a tour of MRI together, very basic one, just to start the ball rolling, and share the results online. So here we are, and without further ado, I'll cut to Pat and let the tour begin.
So yeah, if any of you have looked at my book already, you'll know that it's a fairly high-level conceptual explanation of how Ruby works, which I think is great. But I didn't spend a lot of time going through the code details. So what Peter and I thought we could do today would be to show you guys some of the actual C code and C files inside of Ruby and give you some bearings and some landmarks to look for if you wanted to look around yourself inside of Ruby. So that's what we'll be doing today. Nothing, not too much detail about anything, but we'll just be looking at a lot of different things.
So where do we start on our map?
Well, let's just take a look at. I can see on your screen there on the left side all the different subfolders in the Ruby source code tree, and below that a bunch of different files. A
lot of different files.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we should let people know that they can check this out directly from GitHub at the Ruby project. So it's Ruby/Ruby. But you can also download this stuff from RubyLang direct, like as a tar gzip file as well. And open this up if you want to look at a specific version. I think we've gone for the Edge version of Ruby here, haven't we?
Yeah, and I find it just more convenient to look at the GitHub copy because I'm a fan of GitHub and Git, but yeah, you might find it simpler just to download the tar file.
So, I mean, yeah, some of these folders, I know that if you look at GitHub, it will explain that some of these folders are very, very old. So I think certain ones haven't been updated for years, like I think the BCC32, which is what? It's like Borland C compiler stuff, isn't it?
I think I might have used that in the 1980s or 90s.
Yeah. But, like, which ones of these would you say are important or interesting for us to quickly scan?
Well, one folder I think is interesting is called defs, D-E-F-S.
Right.
And what's neat about this, it has some definitions of different values in here. And, yeah, if you look at that file, keywords, this was fun when I discovered this doing my research because it has actually a definitive list of all the Ruby reserved words. So if you're ever wondering, what are all the keywords in the Ruby language, well, this is where you come to find out.
This is as authoritative as it gets.
Yeah, and this is actually read in by the parsing and compiling code to, to find out what those keywords are. So when it tokenizes your code, it uses these strings in here to look for reserved words.
So do not call any of your variables any of these words, please.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're here just listed in alphabetical order. I think there's some open source software that Ruby uses to convert this into some kind of a table internally. But another interesting folder would be the lib folder, a little farther down.
Yep.
This is the standard library. So this is where a lot of the basic objects and functionality that we all know and love is defined. So a lot of Ruby files in here. If you're ever wondering where the standard library is, well, this is where it is.
Set is probably one of my favorites to show off when I do my courses because it's a class that people don't realize is in the standard library a lot of the time.
Yeah.
If you want to do a lot of their set manipulation and stuff, it's all just here. I think one of the things about the standard library that's interesting to note is that mostly it is written in Ruby itself. So if you look at this file, this is all stuff that you could have written your own set class. But it's all just baked in here for you with tons of documentation, which is really cool as well. There's always tons of comments in the MRI source code. Except when there aren't, of course.
So one of my favorites is singleton, or another
Yep.
one I use a lot is the delegate farther up. So
Yes.
a lot of cool stuff in here.
So this is all good stuff to go through. And if you are bored on a Sunday afternoon and want to read some Ruby code, definitely check through here. It's an interesting insight into what the core team thinks about, how they should write Ruby.
Exactly. It's because, and there's another folder, I think it's called sample, and that's got some
Yes.
sample code. I think they might use it for benchmarking maybe. But what's fun about this is it gives you a chance to see how the Ruby core team would write Ruby. You may not be interested in the details, but it's just fun to see how they format their code and sort of the variable names they choose and that sort of thing.
It's like looking at a tree with like the rings, because I know there's certain files in here that were written very early on in Ruby's life kind of cycle, and it's they're still in here with the old ways of doing Ruby, like pre-symbols even existing in the language and stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot of digging around you can do in here. It is like caving to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But stepping back out, I think the main point to keep in mind when you're trying to get your bearings and find your way around Ruby internals is most of the interesting things that you'll want to look at are in the root folder itself.
This is true.
Yeah, so it's not like a Java app where you have 100 different subfolders with different code files here and there and packages, or even a Rails app has the app folder or models. So for Ruby, since it's a standard C application, most of the interesting code you're going to ever want to look at is just in the root folder and in all these .c files.
Yeah. Unless you really are a masochist and want to play around with, compiling Ruby in Cygwin, or getting on with,
Windows
Google's
32, for example.
Yeah, Windows 32 or Google's native client stuff for running it in a web browser, which I know is very, very new and a very weird experiment they're running. So,
and template has a few other interesting things in it we probably won't have time to talk about today, but these are ERB files. Some of these files are converted into code that's later compiled into Ruby. Kind of an interesting idea. But I don't think we have time for that today. But stepping back out, like I said, most of the stuff that you want to look at in Ruby is in those C files in the root folder. So one other thing we should look at before we look at the C files probably is a good place to get started is under include, and under the Ruby subfolder there's a file called ruby.h.
Yep.
And what's nice about this file, this is actually this include folder, by the way, is what you need to use if you're writing a C extension for Ruby. And if any of you have written C extensions, you'll know you include ruby.h, and that gives you, it defines all the basic concepts and objects that you'll be using and referring to in the C extension code.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of technical stuff in here, macros and setting up your C compiler to compile Ruby properly. But if you scroll down for a while, or Peter, maybe if you search for RBasic.
Yeah. Here we are.
There we go. So starting here, looks like around line 693, this is where Ruby defines a lot of the really core basic C structures. So these aren't objects. Again, these are just memory structures. But these are really the core ideas behind Ruby internals. So this is a great place to start if you really want to look at and begin to understand the C code inside of Ruby.
Right.
So for example, the RBasic structure there is included inside of every Ruby object, and has some technical flags there. I won't go into what those are. And it also has the class value with a K. So class indicates which class this object is an instance of. And then, but after that, a really interesting structure is RObject. So this represents a Ruby object, and actually I talk a lot about this in my book Ruby Under a Microscope. What is a Ruby object, and what's inside of a Ruby object. So one of the reasons I like to study Ruby internals is that if you really want to answer those questions, if you really want to know, what is a Ruby object, well, come here and take a look. Just look at ruby.h and you'll find out. I talk a lot about this in the book. I don't think we have time to go through all the details today. You can see there's something in there. IV pointer actually points to the instance variables for this object, this instance of an object. num IVs, how many variables there are. So we won't go any farther, but this is a great place to start learning if you really want to learn how Ruby works internally.
I guess we can say that it's perhaps not as simple as you may think on the surface. Some of the concepts are simple, but then there's a whole lot of what you would say kind of like optimizations within this file, for supporting much simpler versions of objects that perhaps only have a certain number of instance variables and things like that. And those kind of optimizations are all in this code as well. So that's some of these definitions that you see around the edges. And if you were really, really brave and you wanted to go change some of these numbers and recompile your Ruby, you could have some fun with that. But don't blame us. Don't put it in production.
Exactly. Well, blame Peter. Just don't blame me. What you do on your screen, Peter, is up to you.
Hey,
encourage the viewers.
Your name's on the book, man.
So if you scroll down a little bit farther, we'll see our class, which is the structure that represents every Ruby class. For example, one of the members there is m_tbl. That's the pointer to a method table. See all the methods in that class. Going down farther, if we scroll down some more, we'll see our string, our array. So all the sort of major important built-in Ruby classes that we all know and love have corresponding C structures here that represent them inside of Ruby.
If you can read C, it will definitely help with some of this as well.
Yeah, and as you said, Peter, there's a lot of sort of nitty-gritty, confusing details around the edges. So it's tough if you're not that familiar with C. You kind of have to learn the lingo, so to speak. I think Peter, you said somewhere once that MRI is very idiomatic. So there's a lot of sort of funny ways that the code here is written that you get used to after a while, but it's a little confusing at first.
Some of the indentation isn't quite right either. So, like, if you look at these areas where everything's grouped up, that's not indented properly, and these things within this union aren't indented, or at least in the way that you would be used to doing it in Ruby. So you sometimes have to, read between the lines and work out what's going on here. But I mean,
using Vim, Peter, it probably would look just fine.
Well, what does that? Will that auto lint all this stuff for me?
No, it might be. To be serious here, one thing you want to do is make sure you have the right tab stop settings.
Right, yeah. So there might be mixture of tabs and spaces in here, messing things up.
And maybe Sublime, you just don't have it set up because they have, whatever their default maybe isn't what the Ruby theme uses. Who knows? So,
yeah, some of this code is
take
old.
A minute to sort that out if you're going to look through here a lot because it'll be helpful.
Yeah.
And then, if we scroll down some more, we'll see some more of these basic C structures. And actually, there's one called r hash, so that represents the Ruby hash object. And one of the interesting things there is that the hash itself is behind that pointer ntbl, which points to a structure called st_table. So we might have time to take a look at that later on. But that's the actual hash table, and the r hash structure is a just a wrapper around that.
Right.
So, so the other important pattern to learn about MRI internals is that we've seen each of these basic structures. So more or less, there will be a corresponding C file for each of them. So if we, for example, we wanted to look at the hash class, so we have the r hash structure, but there will also be a code file called hash.c. So for all the major important built-in classes, you'll see a corresponding C file. File.c, array.c, for example. So
I think Rational's got one as well. So, yep.
So what you can do is to learn about how the hash object is implemented is just open up that hash.c file and take a look at what's in there. So all the code inside of Ruby that implements hashes and hash behavior is in this file. And the best way to get started here is actually not to start at the top. At the top, there's a lot of confusing technical stuff, having to do with the actual hash function calculation and other things like that. But if you go to the bottom of the file, you'll see a function called, I believe, init_hash.
Yep, there we are.
It's kind of obvious looking at it. This is where all of the different Ruby methods are declared for this class.
And the class itself, we create the class and then we define we got the RB_C hash, and then you can see that's used in all these subsequent calls to define methods upon that class.
Yeah, exactly. So RB defined class takes, you can pretty obvious, takes two parameters. The first one is the name of the new class. So that's hash with a capital H.
Yeah.
And then the second parameter is the superclass. So the superclass of hash is the object class.
Yeah.
And actually the next line is interesting. They include right away they include the enumerable module into the hash class right after it's been created. So it's so Ruby internally does the same sort of thing you would do if you were defining a class. They just do it in C code instead of Ruby code. But what's really useful about this is it's really a map between the Ruby method names, like to_hash or equals equals, to the underlying C function that defines that method or function. So if you wanted to see how a particular method works inside of Ruby, what happens when I store something in a hash, or what happens when I get something out of a hash, or what happens when I convert a hash to a string or an array. So all those different things are defined here, and you can just look up the C function that implements it and take a look at what happens. So if you want to take a quick look at this one, Peter, it's excuse me, RB hash aref.
Yep. So
this is what looks up a value in a hash. And so if you read this, it says, line 560, if not hash ntbl, or if not stlookup, then return a default value. Otherwise, return the value. So what does this mean? Well, this is a little weird because the first line says if there's no hash table, ntbl, I think we mentioned that a few minutes ago when we were looking at the ruby.h file. So that's the actual hash table. And then it calls this thing st_lookup. So all those functions, it turns out the hash table itself is not implemented in this hash C file. The hash C file contains the Ruby object and its implementation.
Right.
One of the things the Ruby core team did here is interesting is they, instead of reinventing the wheel and writing their own hash table code, they pulled in some open source code from, I think, back in the 1980s and used it. And that code has this prefix st_. So for example, that call there, st_lookup, that's the thing that actually looks up the value that you're requesting. You pass in a key and you want a value. So that function actually does the lookup. And it turns out all those different internal hash functions that the Ruby core team, they didn't write. They pulled it in from, I think, some code written at Berkeley back in the 1980s. All that code is inside of another file called st.c. So if you were curious to know how hash tables actually work inside of Ruby, you could take a look at the code in here. And actually, this is one of the things I talk about a lot in Ruby Under a Microscope is how hashes work. Both because I think it's super interesting and fun, but also because it turns out Ruby uses hash tables and hashes quite a lot, not just when you call hash functions in your code, but it turns out a lot of the Ruby's own internal data structures are hash tables, like method tables or instance variables. A lot of things that Ruby needs to keep track of, it saves in hash tables. So it turns out this code here is quite important. But
you can see where they've added things on as well, because I was just noticing, I know they had the whole problem with the hash collision stuff, where like you could easily create collisions within a hash and kind of DOS someone's Ruby web app off the internet or whatever. So they changed over to using a different type of hash, which I think was murmur hash until recently, and it seems to still be in this code. But I know murmur hash is quite a new type of hash, but they've kind of added it onto the top of the old code that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I didn't know there was a particular incident that caused them to do that. That's interesting.
Yeah, they're using a different one now. I've forgotten the name, but it's mentioned in like the latest post on Ruby Lang. They've switched over to yet another system, which is kind of a variant of this murmur hash. But I think this is for working out like where in the hash table to put the values. So I don't think that actually affects the rest of the code that we were talking about up here, which actually implements the way the hash actually works.
Yeah, this is all pretty self-contained, isolated code in here. And like you said, it has to do with the real mechanics of, what a hash table is. It's like a series of buckets. You save the values in different buckets based on the key and the hash function. So one of the cool things there, actually, there's a table of prime numbers it uses to. It's a little weird. The prime numbers that are near powers of 2, but they use that to decide how many bins or buckets to put in the hash table. But again, this is all very old code, but as you say, the Ruby team's added on to it, improved it over time. So it's kind of it's a fork of that code, I suppose.
So if you start ending up with more than like 1 trillion things in your hash, you might start running into problems.
Yeah, you might. Yeah, well, if that's the case, you probably have other issues to deal with too. Anyway, but let's back out. This is a little bit maybe too much detail for today. But if we go back to the hash.c function where we were earlier, right, one of the other things that's really interesting about Ruby is, so RB define class. So how does that work? And the fact that the hash object is, its superclass is the object class. So we can see where the object class, the same pattern, that's defined in object.c. So let's go over to there. And
again, right to the bottom.
Yeah, again, go straight to the bottom. Don't mess around in the middle. And you'll see the same pattern again. Right, init underscore object. So as you all probably know from being Ruby developers, the object is object class is the superclass for all Ruby classes, and you can see how that's all set up in here. So we have the different methods for that object class are here. Excuse me, but and I don't know why, but it looks like they recently commented out some code there and moved it out.
Yeah.
But so yeah, if you look at init class hierarchy, I think that's actually in the class.c file. So yeah, here we go. Yeah, so this is where all the basic classes for the Ruby object hierarchy are created and initialized. So you can see, actually there's something called the basic object class, which is the real superclass for everything. That might be new to Ruby 1.9. I'm not sure if that was around earlier.
I think that was Ruby 1.9, yeah.
And then the object class is the subclass of that basic object class. And then we have module and class. Those are also defined in here as well. So so this file here, class.c, this is where a lot of the real nitty-gritty complex behavior around classes is defined. What classes are, how they work, what a singleton class is, what a meta class is. That method we saw a few minutes ago, RB define class, there it is right there. So when you define a class, what actually happens? What does Ruby do to define a class? And it's actually not as simple as you might think. One of the things that surprised me actually when I was researching the book was every time you create a class, it actually creates 2 classes under the hood. So there's the class you create, and it also creates something else called a meta class. And if you read through the code here, you can see how that works. But it's pretty complicated, so I wouldn't recommend diving in here right away. But once you're familiar with the R class structure and the R object structure, you can begin to look at how some of this code works in here.
It's good to know about.
Another helpful thing about, I think you mentioned this earlier, Peter, is there's a lot of helpful comments spread around the C code, and a lot of them are pulled out into the documentation, actually.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite comments is back in that other file, object.c.
And it's up here. Is it the diagram?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot here just describing what the object class is, how it works. And this diagram here is really cool. It kind of explains, you can all read it if you want, but it explains how the basic object hierarchy or class hierarchy works inside of Ruby. So, your class, other class, has a superclass of object, and its superclass is basic object. You can follow those arrows moving up. And then, one of the other interesting things about Ruby is this concept of a meta class. And so it explains that here as well, and those are shown in parentheses. So, so the comments here, and then following this is all the C code that implements this stuff in this file object.c and in the other file where we were class.c. So this is all really worth reading, and You'll see this in the docs online, but it's also in the source code as well.
There is a lot of fun reading to be done here.
So it's like it's like diving into a pool and swim. You can go as far as you want. There's as much time and attention span you have, there's plenty to learn.
I mean, you can do this with other ones as well, can't you? Because I know that you've done this with Rubinius and JRuby in particular, haven't you? And they take totally different approaches to some of this stuff, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun too. I'm really glad I did that because it gave me, and I hope if for those of you who read the book, it gives you a sense of, there's not one way of doing everything, and there's different perspectives, different approaches to implementing a language, even the same language. So, and what's cool about JRuby is that since they're using Java to implement Ruby, Java is an object-oriented language, and C is not. C++ is, but C is not, and so it's actually a lot cleaner and easier to understand if you wanted to, if you wanted to get started understanding how Ruby works, but you weren't familiar with C and you weren't, willing to sort of bite off that and try to understand C. Java is a little bit simpler, and since it's object-oriented, a lot of these things are easier to understand. The code is a lot cleaner.
You get a lot for free. Right.
And then the ultimate thing to do is look at Rubinius, because that's implemented with Ruby. So a lot of these sort of built-in classes that we see in MRI, done as C code, those are all done as Ruby code. It's really fascinating. So,
are you saying that this video would be 2 minutes long if we were doing Rubinius instead?
Exactly. It's all so simple. In 2 minutes, we would have covered all this. No, Rubinius is it's a real tour de force. It's an amazing piece of technology, and they've crafted together Ruby to implement a lot of the kernel built-in classes with C++, where they couldn't do it with Ruby, where it was too complicated.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing thing to see those two languages working together. But but for today, I think we were hoping to give people just sort of a lay of the land or some landmarks to look for, the first time they dive into the MRI internals. And so I think the takeaways for you should be, look for these basic classes that are built into Ruby, and you'll find them as individual C files like object.c or array.c, hash.c. And each one of these should have, at the bottom, this map or guide to, which C functions internally implement which Ruby methods. And so if you're ever wondering how, so here's array. If you want to know how unshift works or, first works, you can just look at the corresponding Ruby function. The corresponding C function. So, and again, it's not that easy. There's a lot of macros, a lot of sort of idiomatic expressions in here that are hard to figure out at first, but it's not that hard either. And I think this is a great way to get started. There's a lot more to Ruby internals beyond the basic built-in classes. There's the part that of the code that compiles your Ruby source code and parses it, compiles it, and makes it an executable format of some kind.
Yeah, look at these lines, 11,000 lines in the parse.y file.
Yeah, and
there's a lot of stuff in here.
It's crazy. So this is these are actually grammar rules that are interpreted by something called Bison, which is a parser generator. So lots of really cool stuff here. And Peter, maybe someday, if people like this, we'll have a chance to do another video and dive into some of the details about how all these things work. But I would say if you're just getting started trying to understand how Ruby works, stick to these basic classes and get a sense of the style that the Ruby core team has used to implement this stuff. The variable names, the function names. After a while, you'll get used to it, and it won't be quite as cryptic and confusing. And then at first I would steer clear of the parser. There's also a lot of code. The files that begin with VM_, those are the implementation of the Ruby's virtual machine called YARV. And this is also super fascinating stuff. It's really interesting, but it's really complicated and really difficult to learn. So again, we might look at these things in the future, but I would steer clear of those, at least at first.
Yeah.
Peter, are you still okay? Just too
Yeah,
much secret for one day?
I think this is enough for today. I don't want to send people to sleep too much.
Well, I think this stuff is fascinating, and that's why I took off 6 months to write a book about all this. And the book is much less technical, so if this was a little too much for you, don't give up. In the book Ruby Under a Microscope, I try to give more of a conceptual, high-level explanation of how these things work.
Yeah, this is the work that you did to make that book, isn't it? Really, it's all this navigating around and working out the relationship between everything, and you've boiled that all down into a load of diagrams. I guess that's the one thing I really took away from your book. There's so many diagrams of everything, which is just very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because I'm not a very good writer. It's just easier to draw pictures. But I think it's a picture's worth 1,000 words, and it's a lot. There's a lot of confusing things here, and it's easier to explain them with diagrams. My other goal is that I think this shouldn't just be sort of a hobbyist activity, looking at the internals.
Right.
I think there are a lot of times. Well, I'll put it this way: you get a much deeper understanding of how Ruby works and of how to use Ruby by studying this stuff at some detail, because you get a sense for, okay, what is a hash, or what is an object, or what is an array. And so one of the other goals I had with the book was to give people sort of a mental model they can hang on to as they're writing Ruby code. And I hope some of those diagrams maybe come back to mind as as you're writing code or using an object. Well, what is an object? You might remember an object is a class pointer and an array of instance variables. So that was one of my other goals with the diagrams, is to give something people can remember or sort of visualize when they use the language too.
Yeah, really grasping some of that, what commonly gets called the Ruby object model is really helpful when you're perhaps trying to work out why are class variables bad, but why are class instance variables good in certain situations, and why isn't a class instance variable the same thing as a class variable? What's the difference? And all that type of stuff. You really pick that up from digging into this, and I've definitely found it very useful in my own stuff.
So
what is the best way for people to find your book? If for some reason they live under a rock and they've not heard of your book before, they want to go and find it, what URL can I put on the screen and dazzle them with now?
Well, they can Google Ruby Under a Microscope.
Okay.
Or they can go to patshaughnessy.net/Ruby Under a Microscope with dashes. So not the most easy URL to remember, but it should come up in Google right away.
They know how to use Google, yeah.
Google Ruby and microscope. That'll do it.
If they can't use Google, they're definitely not going to be able to go through this source code. So I think we're safe.
Exactly. And there's a lot of free samples. If you're not, if you don't want to spend any money on it quite yet, if you're not convinced it would be helpful, you can take a look around on my website for some excerpts from the book, which are more or less the same as what's in the actual text.
Cool. I think we'll leave it there then.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to chat with you, Peter, and to look through the stuff. And hopefully we'll have a chance to do it again soon.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Enjoy.